You see an airplane that's too fat, too much cross-section in the fuselage, and wings that are too small. So it has too much drag and not enough lift. Those are the main faults. See, it takes a lot of wing to turn, right? The way an airplane turns is by exercising lift that pulls you around the turn. If you have tiny wings, then you can only fly like an arrow. You can't turn very much. And this airplane doesn't turn very much.
And this is the first thing for a fighter to be able to turn very quickly?
For lots of reasons. I mean, first of all, for air-to-air fighting, it's extremely important, right? Because even though people say the era of the dogfight is over, they're wrong. You know, radar doesn't dominate, and radar missiles have been traditionally the most unreliable missiles. So what counts in air-to-air combat are three things. One, first of all, because the radar cannot identify friend from foe, you have to get close enough to positively identify. You can't simply, the dream, ever since the Korean War, the dream of all air forces, all technological air forces, has been that we look at a scope, we see a blip on the scope from the radar, we press a button, and 13 seconds later the blip disappears. That's perfect. That doesn't work. It didn't work then, it doesn't work today. Because the blip doesn't have a color. It's not red or blue, right? It's just a blip. And in a real air war, where you have lots of airplanes up, the blip is as likely to be a friend as an enemy. So you push the button and you may erase a friend. It happened to us in Vietnam, so we stopped doing it very fast because of that. It's still true to this day, because there is no reliable means, electronic means, that's secure, that the enemy can't bamboozle, that separates red from blue. So if that's the case, then you have to get close enough to see. Close enough to see is like a quarter mile. In very good weather, maybe a half mile, but pretty close. Once you're that close, you know, now you have a dogfight, right? Because if you're that close, he sees you, he turns, you have to turn to get into either missile or gun firing position. Generally, when you're that close, you can't even fire a missile because you're inside the minimum range of the missile, so you're much better off going for a gun kill. But to get the gun kill, you have to turn better than he does, and you have to be smarter, too. And the thing you have to remember is the pilot is vastly more important than the airplane. Okay? In everything we're discussing here about the importance of turn, the importance of lots of engine and thrust and so on, none of that counts relative to the pilot. A good pilot in a terrible airplane is far more valuable than a fabulous airplane and a poor pilot.
Okay.
In every form, in every war we've ever fought, pilots were the dominant issue. But that has a very big impact on this question of what kind of airplane. Because when you get a super complicated airplane that can't fly very much because it has to spend 100 hours on the ground for every hour that it flies, you know, you can't get good pilots. Good pilots have to fly, they have to train. You have to have airplanes in which they can train. So the JSF, in and of itself, because of its complexity, has already doomed you to inferior pilots, because you can never get enough hours with it. Yes, the wing area, what really counts is what we call wing loading, which means how many pounds of airplane does every square foot or every square meter of wing have to carry. The less pounds that it carries, the more the lift can be devoted to turning. The JSF has enormously high wing loading, as high as a very similar airplane. By the way, there's a strikingly similar airplane from the Vietnam War called the F-105. And they're very comparable airplanes because the JSF is just about as unmaneuverable as the F-105. The F-105 was so famous for unmaneuverability among its pilots that it was always called the lead sled. And in fact, the unmaneuverability led to the loss of almost the entire fleet to SAMs, guns, and MiGs. MiG-17s could tear it apart because they were so much more maneuverable. MiG-21s, which came in later in the war, tore it apart even worse because they could outturn it so easily. There was no escape for a 105 pilot, you know. If he'd get jumped by a MiG and he had this tiny wing and this huge fuselage and huge tonnage of weight, wasn't much he could do. He could try to turn, but an airplane with much less weight and much larger wings could always turn inside him.
So this is a dangerous airplane.
Yes.
A vulnerable airplane.
A very vulnerable airplane, vulnerable in many ways. First of all, because of the maneuverability. And so far we've only been talking about air-to-air, which in some wars is a problem, and in lots of wars is not so dominant. In the Vietnam War, it wasn't the dominant cause of loss. The dominant cause of loss was guns, and to a very secondary extent, ground-to-air missiles. But again, to defeat those, you need to maneuver. Anytime you fly straight and level in the presence of guns or missiles, you're a dead duck. You know, the only thing that defeats aimed gunfire, you know, is jinking, maneuvering. Again, it takes lots of wing and not so much weight. And defeating missiles is absolutely dependent on maneuvering. You know, big ground-to-air missiles are very easy to defeat. You know, amazingly easy to defeat. Only two things. You have to know they're coming, so you have to have warning, either from electronic warning or visual warning. And of course, they let out lots of smoke so you can see them. And then as soon as you know and you've been trained, it doesn't even take hard maneuvers, just fairly light maneuvers, and you can totally defeat the missile's tracking system. But you have to be able to turn. If you're forced to fly very gently in the presence of the missile, you're a dead duck. Like helicopters. This is the problem with helicopters. They can't maneuver. They can only pull 2G maneuver, which is hardly anything. And so they're dead ducks in the presence of ground fire and in the presence of missiles. Most air forces are heavily oriented towards bombing deep in the enemy's homeland as an independent mission, like the RAF always wanted to do.
Yes.
Right? Which is a useless mission, by the way. Totally useless, and one that simply lengthens. Every war in which we've bombed has been lengthened because of it. It has been counterproductive. Ground support, or what we in the U.S. call close support, is diametrically opposed to that. Is a totally different mission. Can be very helpful if it's done with skill and by people who are committed to doing it. It's a huge help to soldiers on the ground. Directly supporting troops on the ground who are in trouble, who are about to be overrun, who have been ambushed, or have just made a breakthrough. You know, it takes a lot of skill, a lot of very quick response. It takes a lot of people who want to do it. But it can be very helpful, and that's very useful. Neither airplane has the slightest bit of capability in that mission. The JSF doesn't, the F-16 doesn't either. To do that mission, you need an airplane that's far slower, far more maneuverable than any of the jets, and tough. I mean, really, so you can shoot holes in it all day and come home. That's what the A-10 is. That's why I worked on the A-10. That's why I'm far more proud of the A-10 than I am of the F-16. It was in many ways a much harder thing to do, and far harder to get the Air Force to accept. The Air Force hated this. All Air Forces that I know of hate that mission, because it's a mission that's a service to the Army. It makes them feel like they're part of the artillery or something, so they don't have this, especially the generals. The pilots who do the mission can become very committed. On my team designing the A-10, we had a lot of pilots who'd done real close support in Vietnam. Were totally committed to it. You know, once they do it and they see how useful it is, of course they, you know, the problem is never pilots. The problem is always generals and bureaucrats.
But the F-35 is supposed to be a follow-up on the A-10.
That's the most laughable thing I ever heard. It is totally incapable, even more incapable than the F-16 of doing close support. And the F-16, much as I'm proud of the work I did on that, I would never claim that that airplane has any capability in close support.
So
and the JSF is 50 times worse in close support, because it's so much easier to shoot down, so much more flammable, so much less maneuver, and doesn't even have the ability to stay and wait, you know, over a battlefield until a situation develops where it's needed. You know, no loiter time. It's a huge fuel flow, very inefficient in a slow loiter mode. It's hopeless in that mission, and doesn't have any weapons to use for that mission. To do that mission right, the single most important thing you need is a really hefty armor-penetrating cannon. That's why we have the 30 millimeter on the A-10. Anything that doesn't have that is basically not much help in close support. You have a lot of people who either watch science fiction movies, who think all this automation in the radar and the stealth is all wonderful and gee whiz, you know, same kind of people who think that, you know, that every space shot is a triumph of technology. You get these kind of people involved and fascinated, so they become advocates of the JSF. But anybody who reads about war and airplanes in war seriously and looks at the evidence of when airplanes work and when they don't work, they couldn't possibly believe that the JSF would approach even being a usable fighter, much less a great fighter.